Cop humiliates elderly black man in the mud, but never imagined what the son would do next. 600 words. Have you ever imagined seeing your father, a 70-year-old man, being thrown into the mud by a corrupt cop while others laugh and film? That's exactly what happened to James Smith, a respected retired teacher from South Chicago. Before we continue this shocking story, hit the notification bell, leave a like, and comment which city you're watching from. This is a story every American needs to hear. It was a rainy March afternoon when Mr. Smith was returning from the local farmer's market carrying his groceries. Officer Mike Rodriguez, known in the neighborhood for his history of violence, stopped his patrol car upon seeing the elderly man. What happened in the next few minutes would forever change the fate of several families. Paul Smith, James's son, was a district attorney who had dedicated 15 years of his life to fighting police corruption. That day, upon receiving the viral video of his father's humiliation on social media, something inside him snapped. The young prosecutor, who always believed in institutional justice, began to devise a plan that would shake the system to its core. Officer Rodriguez didn't know, but the elderly man he humiliated wasn't just any ordinary senior citizen. The Smith family held powerful secrets, and what would happen in the coming weeks would become an urban legend in Chicago's precincts. Would Paul be able to get justice without becoming what he had always fought against? What happens when a man of the law decides to take justice into his own hands? This story will make you question, how far would you go to defend your family's honor? As Paul watched the video for the 10th time, his hands shaking with rage, he realized that this wasn't just about his father anymore. It was about every person who had ever suffered at the hands of corrupt cops like Rodriguez. It was about a system that protected the wrong people and punished the innocent. He thought about all the cases he had prosecuted, all the times he had defended the integrity of the law enforcement system. Now, it felt like a cruel joke. His father, a man who had spent his life educating children and fighting for civil rights, reduced to a viral video of humiliation. The comments under the video were a mix of outrage and resignation. Some called for Rodriguez's badge. Others cynically remarked that nothing would change. Paul knew that most of these commenters would forget about this incident in a week, but for him, it was just the beginning. He picked up his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. "Sarah, it's Paul. I need your help. It's time we finished what we started in law school." Sarah Carter, now an investigative journalist, had been Paul's partner in uncovering a college corruption scandal years ago. They had vowed to fight injustice wherever they found it, but life had taken them on different paths, until now. As he hung up, Paul looked at the framed photo on his desk, him and his father at his law school graduation. He remembered his father's words that day. "Son, the law is a powerful tool. Use it to lift people up, not to push them down." Paul touched the photo, his resolve hardening. "I'm sorry, Dad," he whispered. "But sometimes, to lift people up, you have to tear the whole damn building down first." Little did Officer Rodriguez know, but his act of cruelty had set in motion a chain of events that would expose decades of corruption, shake the Chicago Police Department to its core, and redefine justice in a city long accustomed to looking the other way. The storm was coming, and Paul Smith was about to become its eye. Chicago wasn't just the backdrop for this story, it was a character in its own right, with its bustling streets and stark contrasts. In the South Side neighborhood of Englewood, Mr. James Smith was a beloved figure, the teacher who had taught generations of children during his 40 years at the local public school. James had raised his son Paul alone after his wife's untimely death. Widowed at 35, he devoted himself entirely to Paul's education, raising him on stories of dignity and justice. Even in retirement, he still volunteered teaching adult literacy classes at the local community center. On the other side of this story stood Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, 45, a third-generation police officer. His father had died in the line of duty, turning him into a bitter and violent man. At the precinct, he was feared by subordinates and protected by superiors who turned a blind eye to his unconventional policing methods. Paul Smith, 35, had become a district attorney inspired by the injustices he witnessed during his childhood in the neighborhood. Married to Rachel, a public defender, he had built an unshakable reputation in the DA's office. His colleagues called him incorruptible, a nickname he wore with pride until that fateful day. The humiliation video went viral through Marcus, a teenager who worked at the farmer's market. With his cell phone, he captured the moment Rodriguez approached Mr. Smith, demanding identification, and unsatisfied with the elderly man's attitude, pushed him into a mud puddle, shouting racial slurs that would shock even his staunchest defenders. At the precinct where Rodriguez worked, Captain Lisa Johnson had been observing the sergeant's behavior for some time. Black like Mr. Smith, she kept a secret file on the officer's irregularities, but had never gathered enough evidence to bring him down. Her testimony would prove crucial in the events to come. Englewood, once considered one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in America, had changed significantly thanks to people like Mr. Smith. The public humiliation of the beloved teacher sparked a wave of silent indignation among residents who knew Sergeant Rodriguez's history all too well. Rachel, Paul's wife, noticed the change in her husband as soon as he saw the video. The man who had always defended due process began spending sleepless nights, scouring old files, and making mysterious phone calls. She noticed something was different when she found a hidden folder in his office with photos of Sergeant Rodriguez and detailed notes on his routine. The system Paul had so long defended began to show its cracks. As he prepared his revenge, he discovered that 5 other abuse cases involving Rodriguez had been shelved in recent years. All the victims were black, all the investigations inconclusive. Among the neighborhood residents, stories circulated about Smith's archive, decades of records that the teacher had kept on police violence in the area. No one knew for sure if it existed, but Paul was about to discover that his father had far more information than anyone imagined. Sarah Carter, now working for the Chicago Tribune, began her own investigation, uncovering a pattern of similar incidents across the city's south side. Her research suggested a systemic problem that went far beyond a single corrupt officer. As the pieces began to fall into place, Paul realized the enormity of what he was up against. This wasn't just about one officer or one incident. It was about a deeply entrenched system of corruption. The story was no longer just about public humiliation. It was about a system that protected the wrong people, about a son willing to do anything for justice, and about how sometimes revenge can come disguised as justice. In his office late one night, Paul stared at the wall covered in photos, documents, and red string connecting the dots. He realized that to bring down Rodriguez, he would have to expose the entire corrupt system. It would be dangerous, possibly career-ending, but he knew there was no turning back. As he turned off the light, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Meet me at Grant Park midnight. I have information about Rodriguez you need to see." Paul hesitated, knowing this could be a trap, but he also knew that in the pursuit of justice, sometimes you have to take risks. The clock was ticking, and Paul Smith was about to dive into the darkest corners of Chicago's law enforcement. The question was, would he emerge with the truth, or would the system swallow him whole? Paul's first move was subtle. Using his contacts in the DA's office, he began to unearth all the shelved cases involving Sergeant Rodriguez. What he found was disturbing. 23 complaints of abuse of authority, 15 accusations of racial violence, and 7 suspicious deaths during police encounters, all dismissed due to lack of evidence. Meanwhile, Mr. Smith was still recovering from the trauma. The video of his humiliation had reached 2 million views, and the media was beginning to pressure for answers. The police department, as usual, issued a standard statement promising to investigate the matter. Rodriguez was temporarily suspended but kept his full salary and laughed about the situation with colleagues at the local bar. Paul discovered that his father wasn't Rodriguez's first elderly victim. In Smith's archive, he found meticulous records of 3 similar cases in the last 5 years. The retired teacher had documented each incident, including names, dates, and witnesses, painstaking work that would now prove invaluable. Captain Lisa Johnson, after seeing the video, secretly approached Paul. She revealed that Rodriguez was part of a larger corruption scheme within the department. The officer not only abused his authority, but also extorted local businesses and had connections with influential politicians. The revenge plan began to take shape when Paul received an anonymous call. It was Rodriguez's former partner, kicked off the force years ago, willing to testify about a covered-up execution case. The corrupt cop had far more skeletons in his closet than anyone imagined. Rachel noticed her husband was changing. The prosecutor, who always defended the law, now spent entire nights planning something she feared to discover. "You're turning into what you've always fought against," she warned one night, but Paul was already too far gone to listen. The conflict escalated when Rodriguez, feeling pressured, began making veiled threats. Unknown cars started circling the Smiths' house. The message was clear: messing with him would have consequences. But the officer didn't count on one detail. Paul had installed security cameras throughout the neighborhood, recording every suspicious movement. The Inglewood community, initially fearful, began to mobilize. Mr. Smith's former students, now lawyers, teachers, and community leaders, formed a protection network. The case ceased to be just about personal revenge and transformed into a movement for justice. Marcus, the teenager who filmed the assault, started receiving threats. Paul placed him under protection, realizing the boy would be a crucial witness. The young man revealed he had more videos of other violent encounters with the same officer, material he had kept out of fear of retaliation. The turning point came when Paul discovered through his father's records that Rodriguez was involved in the death of his own father, the previous generation's police officer. It hadn't been a shootout with criminals, as official records stated. It was a much darker story, involving embezzlement and betrayal. Tension reached its peak when Rodriguez, drunk in a bar, boasted about humiliating the elderly man, unaware he was being recorded. "I put that uppity old man in his place," he said, using racist terms that would shock even his staunchest defenders. Paul now had all the puzzle pieces, but his thirst for revenge put him in a moral dilemma. Use the system he had always defended, or take justice into his own hands? The answer would come from an unexpected source and would forever change the meaning of justice in Chicago. As Paul delved deeper, he uncovered a network of corruption that extended far beyond the police department. City officials, judges, and even some of his colleagues in the DA's office were implicated. The more he discovered, the more dangerous his position became. Sarah Carter, working tirelessly on her end, began to receive anonymous threats. Her apartment was broken into, her computer stolen. But instead of backing down, she doubled her efforts, realizing they were onto something big. In a clandestine meeting with Captain Johnson, Paul learned of an upcoming major drug operation that Rodriguez and his corrupt colleagues were planning to hijack. This could be their chance to catch them red-handed, but it would require precise timing and irrefutable evidence. Rachel, torn between her duties as a public defender and her loyalty to Paul, stumbled upon information that could exonerate one of her clients while implicating Rodriguez. She faced an ethical dilemma that would test her marriage and her professional integrity. As the pieces fell into place, Paul realized that taking down Rodriguez and his network would shake the very foundations of Chicago's power structure. He was no longer just fighting for his father's honor. He was taking on a system that had perpetuated injustice for decades. With time running out and the stakes higher than ever, Paul knew he had to make a decision. Would he stay within the bounds of the law he had sworn to uphold, or would he step into the shadows to bring light to the truth? As he stood at this crossroads, Paul remembered his father's words. "Sometimes, son, doing what's right isn't the same as doing what's legal." The path ahead was dangerous, but for the first time in months, Paul felt a sense of clarity. The real fight was just beginning. As Paul delved deeper into his quest for justice, other stories began to intertwine, adding layers of complexity to the main plot. Rachel, Paul's wife, faced her own dilemma. As a public defender, she was assigned to defend a young man wrongly accused of drug trafficking, a case that it turned out had connections to Rodriguez's scheme. The conflict between her professional duty and her loyalty to her husband began to weigh heavily, especially when she realized that Paul's actions could compromise her client's case. Meanwhile, Marcus, the teenager under protection, saw his life turn upside down. Threatened by Rodriguez's accomplices, he was forced to leave school and his job at the farmer's market. Paul put him in an improvised protection program, but the isolation began to affect the boy's mental health. Marcus's story became a reflection of the consequences that police corruption had on the youth of the inner city. Captain Lisa Johnson, for her part, initiated a covert internal investigation. She discovered that Rodriguez's scheme was just the tip of the iceberg of a corruption network that extended to the upper echelons of the police and state government. Each step she took put her in greater danger, but also brought her closer to exposing the entire rotten structure. In the neighborhood, an unexpected subplot began to develop. Mrs. Evelyn Washington, an 80-year-old woman and former colleague of Mr. Smith, began organizing a movement of elderly citizens against police violence. What started as meetings in her living room soon transformed into peaceful protests that attracted national media attention. Meanwhile, Rodriguez's son, a young rookie officer named Tyler, entered into internal conflict upon discovering the extent of his father's criminal activities. Raised to follow in Rodriguez's footsteps, Tyler found himself divided between family loyalty and his newly awakened sense of justice. The pressure of time intensified when Paul discovered that Rodriguez was planning to flee the country. The corrupt officer had scheduled a meeting with influential politicians to ensure his exit, giving Paul only a week to act before the man who humiliated his father escaped unpunished. An unexpected twist occurred when an investigative journalist, Alicia Mendez, approached Paul with surprising information. She had discovered that Mr. Smith's case wasn't isolated. There was a pattern of abuse against elderly black citizens across the city, suggesting an unofficial policy of intimidation in minority communities. Mr. Smith's health began to deteriorate due to post-traumatic stress. His condition became a constant reminder to Paul of the personal cost of his quest for vengeance, adding a race against time to see justice done while his father could still witness it. In the midst of this whirlwind, Smith's archive proved more valuable than anyone could have imagined. Beyond cases of police abuse, it contained evidence of a corruption network that extended back decades, involving powerful figures in Chicago politics and judiciary. Sarah Carter's investigation led her to a whistleblower within the police department who was willing to talk, but only if guaranteed complete anonymity and protection. This source could be the key to unraveling the entire conspiracy, but using the information would put Sarah's career and possibly her life at risk. As the day of the major drug operation approached, Paul and his allies worked frantically to put all the pieces in place. They knew this might be their only chance to catch Rodriguez and his corrupt network in the act, but the risks were enormous. One wrong move could not only jeopardize the case but also put countless lives in danger. Each of these subplots intertwined with the main story, creating a complex web of relationships and conflicts. Paul found himself at the center of a storm where each decision could have ramifications not just for his personal vendetta, but for the entire justice system of Chicago. Time was running out, and Paul needed to decide. Would he follow the path of the law he had always defended, or would he yield to the temptation of taking justice into his own hands? The answer to this question would affect not only his fate, but that of everyone around him. As the clock ticked down, Paul realized that the coming days would define not just his future, but the future of justice in Chicago. The stage was set for a confrontation that would shake the city to its core. The night everything changed began with an anonymous phone call. Paul, exhausted after days of frantic investigation, answered hesitantly. The voice on the other end was familiar, but he couldn't immediately place it. "Meet me at the abandoned warehouse on Halsted Street in an hour. Come alone." The line went dead before Paul could ask any questions. Against his better judgment, Paul decided to go. The location was an old, abandoned storage facility on the outskirts of Englewood. When he arrived, the figure waiting in the shadows stunned him. It was Tyler, Rodriguez's son. "I know what my father did," Tyler began, his voice trembling, "and I know what you're planning. But there's something you need to know before you do anything." Tyler then revealed a shocking truth. Rodriguez wasn't just a corrupt cop, but part of a much larger organization, internally known as the Brotherhood. This network of corrupt officers, politicians, and judges had controlled much of Chicago's underworld for decades. "My father, he's not the monster you think he is. He's a piece in a much bigger game," Tyler explained, handing Paul a flash drive. "Here's proof of everything, names, dates, transactions. If you expose this, it won't just be my father who falls. It'll be the entire system." Paul was paralyzed. The flash drive in his hands felt as heavy as lead. He realized that his quest for personal vengeance had inadvertently unearthed something much larger and more dangerous than he could have imagined. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Paul, crucial events were unfolding in other parts of the city. At the precinct, Captain Lisa Johnson finally gathered the courage to confront her superiors about the widespread corruption. Her action triggered a series of events that put the entire police structure on high alert. Rachel, Paul's wife, made a shocking discovery in her public defense case. The young man she was defending wasn't just innocent, but a deliberate victim of Rodriguez's scheme to cover up larger crimes. This revelation put her on a direct collision course with the forces her husband was facing. Marcus, the teenager under protection, received an unexpected visit from Mrs. Evelyn Washington. The elderly activist brought with her an old box containing documents that her late husband, an honest ex-cop, had kept for years. These papers, combined with Marcus's videos, formed an explosive dossier on decades of police abuse in the neighborhood. At the hospital, Mr. Smith woke from a fitful sleep with a sudden, clear memory. He remembered an incident from 30 years ago involving Rodriguez's father, a crucial piece of the puzzle Paul was putting together. And Rodriguez, the corrupt officer, was in panic mode. Feeling the noose tightening, he made a desperate decision. He contacted his most powerful allies, demanding protection in exchange for his silence. The Brotherhood was on high alert, ready to do whatever necessary to protect itself. Back at the warehouse, Paul stared at Tyler, his mind in turmoil. The young officer made a final offer. "You have two options, Paul. Use this information to bring down the entire system, but know that it will put you and everyone you love in mortal danger. Or we can make a deal. My father turns himself in, confesses to his crimes, but the full extent of the corruption remains hidden. Your father gets justice, and you keep your family safe." At that moment, Paul realized he was no longer dealing with just avenging his father's humiliation. He was at the epicenter of a battle that could redefine Chicago's justice system, perhaps even the entire country's. The decision Paul would make in the next few minutes would not only affect his fate and that of his family, but potentially the future of an entire city. The prosecutor, who had always believed in institutional justice, now found himself with the power to expose a truth that few would dare to face. As Paul weighed his options, his phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah. "Paul, I've got something big. Meet me ASAP. This changes everything." The clock was ticking. The city slept, unaware of the drama unfolding in its underbelly. And Paul, with the weight of the world on his shoulders, had to make a choice. He looked at Tyler, then at the flash drive in his hand. The easy path was clear. Take the deal, get justice for his father, and walk away. But the faces of all those who had suffered under the corrupt system flashed through his mind. Paul took a deep breath and made his decision. "Tyler," he said, his voice steady, "I'm going to need your help. We're taking down the whole damn thing." As he left the warehouse, Paul knew there was no turning back. The storm was about to break, and he was going to be right in the middle of it. The next 48 hours would determine the fate of Chicago's justice system, and Paul Smith was ready to risk everything for the truth. Paul left the warehouse with the flash drive firmly grasped, his mind a storm of possibilities and consequences. He opted for a risky path, to use the information, but strategically. In the following 48 hours, a series of cascading events shook Chicago. Paul delivered part of the information to Captain Lisa Johnson, giving her ammunition to initiate an internal operation in the police force. Within hours, several high-ranking officers were detained for questioning. Through a secure contact, he leaked another part of the content to Alicia Mendez, the investigative journalist. The next morning, explosive headlines splashed across newspapers and news sites, exposing the tip of the iceberg of corruption. Rachel, using the new evidence, managed not only to clear her client of false charges, but also to open a case against the state for police misconduct. Rodriguez, seeing his world crumble, tried to flee. But surprisingly, it was his own son, Tyler, who stopped him, choosing integrity over family loyalty. The reaction was immediate and intense. Protests erupted across the city, led by Mrs. Evelyn Washington and her group of elderly activists. Thousands took to the streets, demanding police reform and justice. The mayor called an emergency press conference, promising a full and impartial investigation. However, his words rang hollow to an enraged population. The Brotherhood, caught off guard, went into panic mode. Some members began negotiating plea deals, while others planned revenge against those they considered traitors. In Englewood, an atmosphere of cautious hope settled in. For the first time in decades, residents felt their voices were being heard. Mr. Smith, watching everything on the hospital TV, cried with relief and pride. His archive, built over a lifetime, had finally served a greater purpose. Paul, however, faced a new dilemma. He had detonated a bomb, but now had to deal with the explosion. Threats against his family intensified. He and Rachel were forced to move temporarily to a safe location under police protection, ironically guarded by some of the same officers who previously turned a blind eye to corruption. Marcus, the young man who filmed the original assault, became an unwitting symbol of the movement. His courage inspired other young people from the inner city to speak out against injustices. Captain Lisa Johnson, now leading the anti-corruption task force, worked tirelessly. Each new discovery revealed deeper layers of corruption, extending to sectors Paul hadn't even imagined. The impact spread beyond Chicago. Other American cities began scrutinizing their own police forces, fearing similar scandals. Meanwhile, Rodriguez, now in custody, faced not only criminal charges, but also the weight of public contempt. His world of impunity and power crumbled in a matter of days. Paul realized that his quest for vengeance had transformed into something much larger. He was no longer just a son seeking justice for his father, but a catalyst for long-needed systemic change. As days passed, it became clear that the battle was far from over. The Brotherhood still had powerful allies, and resistance to change was fierce. Paul knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous. One night, while visiting his father in the hospital, Mr. Smith held his son's hand and said, "Son, you've done more than avenge my honor. You've given hope to an entire city." Paul looked out the hospital window, seeing Chicago's lights shining in the distance. He knew that each of those lights represented lives that would be affected by the storm he had unleashed. The question now was, would he have the strength to see this through to the end? The next morning, as Paul prepared for a crucial meeting with federal investigators, he received a cryptic message. "You've opened Pandora's box. Be at Navy Pier at midnight if you want to know how deep this really goes." Paul knew that every step forward was fraught with danger, but there was no turning back now. The fate of Chicago's justice system hung in the balance, and he was determined to see it through, no matter the cost. The following weeks tested Paul in ways he had never imagined. The prosecutor, who had always trusted the system, now found himself navigating treacherous waters where each decision could mean life or death. The first challenge came with an assassination attempt against Marcus. The young man was shot in front of his house, barely surviving. This incident served as a brutal reminder of the risks involved. Paul, consumed by guilt, realized that his crusade had real consequences for innocent people. Rachel, seeing her husband on the verge of collapse, decided to take charge. She organized a network of lawyers and human rights activists to protect the witnesses and victims involved in the case. Her initiative not only saved lives, but also showed Paul that he wasn't alone in this fight. Meanwhile, Mr. Smith had a health relapse. In the hospital, he asked to speak to his son alone. "Paul," he said, his voice weak but determined, "remember why we started this. It's not about revenge. It's about justice. Don't lose your humanity in the process." These words hit Paul deeply. He realized he was becoming so obsessed with bringing down the corrupt system that he was losing sight of the values that led him to become a prosecutor in the first place. Captain Lisa Johnson faced her own challenges. As the investigation progressed, she uncovered corruption at levels she had never imagined. Colleagues she considered friends were exposed as part of the Brotherhood. In a moment of weakness, she considered giving up, but an unexpected visit from Mrs. Evelyn Washington reminded her of the impact of her work on the community. The case gained national dimensions. Journalists from across the country converged on Chicago, turning the city into the epicenter of a national debate on police reform and systemic corruption. Paul, initially reluctant, realized the importance of using the media to his advantage. With Alicia Mendez's help, he learned to navigate the treacherous terrain of public opinion, transforming himself into an eloquent spokesperson for the cause. Tyler, Rodriguez's son, went through his own journey of redemption. Rejected by former colleagues and viewed with suspicion by reformists, he found an unlikely ally in Marcus. The two young men, coming from opposite sides of the law, formed a powerful partnership, working to rebuild trust between the police and the community. Paul faced his toughest test when he was offered a deal by the remnants of the Brotherhood. They promised to turn themselves in and provide crucial evidence in exchange for reduced sentences. The offer was tempting. It could end the case quickly and ensure some form of justice, but Paul knew that accepting would mean compromising the principles he was fighting for. After sleepless nights and heated debates with Rachel, Paul made his decision. He rejected the deal, opting for a longer and more uncertain path, but one that promised deeper and more lasting change. This decision nearly cost him his life. An attempt was made on Paul's life, leaving him hospitalized for weeks. During his recovery, something extraordinary happened. People from all corners of Chicago, and even from other cities, took turns protecting his house and family. Paul's fight had become everyone's fight. When he finally returned to work, Paul was a changed man. The near-death experience made him reassess his priorities and methods. He realized that to truly change the system, he needed to work within it, inspiring others to join the cause. With a new approach, Paul began building unlikely alliances. He reached out to honest cops disillusioned with the system, reform-minded politicians eager for change, and long-marginalized community leaders. Together, they began weaving a new web of justice and accountability. The process was slow and often frustrating. There were setbacks and moments of doubt. But with each small victory, a corrupt officer convicted, a reform law passed, a community empowered, Paul felt they were making real progress. A year after the incident with his father, Paul stood before a mixed audience of police officers, activists, and Englewood residents. His speech wasn't one of vengeance or anger, but of hope and unity. "We're not just fighting against something," he said. "We're fighting for something. For a city where justice knows no color or class." As he looked at the faces in the crowd, Mr. Smith, proud and recovered, Rachel, his rock and conscience, Marcus and Tyler, symbols of reconciliation, Lisa Johnson, tireless in her pursuit of integrity, Paul realized that his personal journey of vengeance had transformed into a collective mission of renewal. The fight was far from over, but for the first time, Paul felt that victory was possible. Not just for him or his father, but for an entire city that dared to dream of a better future. The stage was set for the final confrontation. After months of meticulous investigations, evidence gathering, and alliance building, Paul and his team were ready to deliver the decisive blow against what remained of the Brotherhood. Tension was palpable throughout Chicago. Rumors about a massive operation circulated in the corridors of power. The last members of the criminal organization, feeling the noose tightening, became increasingly desperate and dangerous. Paul, working tirelessly, coordinated the final details with Captain Lisa Johnson. They had mapped out the entire corruption network, from corrupt cops to high-ranking judges and politicians. The operation, codenamed Daybreak, would be the largest anti-corruption action in Chicago's history. Rachel, now a central figure in the legal strategy, prepared for the inevitable legal challenges that would arise. She had assembled a team of dedicated lawyers, ready to ensure that each arrest and seizure was legally irrefutable. Marcus, recovered from the assassination attempt, had become an influential activist. He organized vigils and peaceful protests throughout Englewood, maintaining popular pressure and reminding everyone why this fight was so important. Tyler, Rodriguez's repentant son, proved to be a key piece. His inside information was crucial to dismantling the last defenses of the Brotherhood. He knew his testimony in the upcoming trial would be pivotal, but it would also put him in great danger. Mrs. Evelyn Washington and her group of elderly activists remained vigilant. They had become the eyes and ears of the community, reporting any suspicious activity and keeping morale high in the neighborhoods most affected by police corruption. The media was in a frenzy. Alicia Mendez, working closely with Paul, prepared a series of explosive reports that would be released simultaneously with the operation, ensuring maximum exposure and preventing any attempt to cover up the case. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power, tension was palpable. Nervous politicians made frantic calls, trying to find out if their names were on the list. Corrupt judges desperately sought a way out, some considering fleeing, others contemplating plea deals. The Brotherhood, cornered, planned one last desperate counterattack. Leaked information indicated they were preparing an operation to discredit Paul and his team, including fabricating false evidence and a massive smear campaign. Paul, aware of the risks, took extraordinary precautions. He moved his family to a safe location and doubled the security of everyone involved in the operation. Every move was carefully planned, every communication rigorously encrypted. On the eve of the operation, Paul visited his father in the hospital. Mr. Smith, though frail, emanated an inner strength that inspired his son. "Tomorrow," said the old teacher, "you won't just be doing justice for me, but for an entire generation that has suffered in silence." Back in his improvised office, Paul made a final review of the plan. Maps of the city covered the walls, marked with the operation's targets. Piles of documents and evidence were meticulously organized. Every detail had been checked and double-checked. At midnight, Paul received the final confirmation. All teams were in position. Federal agents, prosecutors, and special agents spread throughout Chicago awaited the signal to begin the largest anti-corruption operation in the city's history. With a mix of determination and apprehension, Paul looked out the window at the city he loved. Chicago, usually vibrant even at night, seemed strangely quiet, as if holding its breath in anticipation of dawn. In a few hours, the first rays of sun would touch the skyscrapers, and with them would come the beginning of a new era for Chicago. Paul knew the next day would change everything. Justice, so long delayed, would finally have its chance. With one last look at his father's photo on his desk, Paul picked up the phone. It was time to give the signal. Operation Daybreak was about to begin. As he dialed the number that would set everything in motion, Paul felt the weight of history on his shoulders. This wasn't just about his father anymore, or even about Chicago. It was about setting a precedent that could change the face of justice across the nation. "It's time," he said into the phone, his voice steady. "Let's bring the dawn." The dawn in Chicago was marked by the deafening sound of helicopters and sirens. Operation Daybreak began with military precision, simultaneously hitting dozens of targets across the city. Paul, in the improvised command center, coordinated the action with Captain Lisa Johnson. Screens showed live feeds from various teams in action. The tension was palpable as they watched the events unfold. At the mansion of the Brotherhood's leader, an influential politician, the FBI's elite team encountered armed resistance. The shootout lasted tense minutes, but ended with the surrender of the guards and the arrest of the corrupt leader, found hiding in an underground bunker. Simultaneously, in a luxurious law office downtown, prosecutors and police officers surprised an emergency meeting of the organization's key members. Incriminating documents were seized before they could be destroyed, providing crucial evidence of decades of corruption. At the federal courthouse, corrupt judges were arrested in their own chambers, an unprecedented scene that shocked the judicial system. The operation exposed an intricate network of manipulated sentences and archived cases in exchange for favors and money. Meanwhile, in Englewood, Marcus led a peaceful vigil in front of the local police station. The community, united, watched as corrupt officers who had terrorized the neighborhood for years were arrested. It was a scene of collective catharsis, with many residents weeping with relief and hope. Rachel, at the courthouse, worked tirelessly to ensure that each warrant and each arrest was legally unassailable. Her team of lawyers faced a barrage of appeals and habeas corpus petitions, fighting to keep the criminals behind bars. The media went into a frenzy. Alicia Mendez, with her team of journalists, broadcast live, revealing shocking details of the operation and the extent of the corruption. Social media exploded with reactions, making Operation Daybreak the most talked-about topic across the country. However, the Brotherhood still had one last trump card. A group of corrupt officers, led by a former colleague of Rodriguez, initiated a desperate action. They invaded the operations center, determined to destroy evidence and eliminate key witnesses. Paul and Lisa found themselves in the middle of an intense shootout. Barricaded in the control room, they fought to protect vital information and coordinate the response. It was at this moment that Tyler, Rodriguez's son, definitively proved his worth. Using his inside knowledge, he guided an elite team through secret passages of the building, surprising the invaders from behind. The confrontation was brutal and quick. When the smoke cleared, the last resistors of the Brotherhood were either surrendered or dead. Paul, with a slight arm wound, emerged from the control room to find a scene of controlled chaos. As the operation entered its final phase, similar scenes unfolded throughout Chicago. Arrests were made in mansions, corporate offices, and even at a luxurious country house on the outskirts of the city. The corruption network, built over decades, crumbled in a matter of hours. At the hospital, Mr. Smith watched everything on television, tears of pride streaming down his wrinkled face. Mrs. Evelyn Washington and her group of elderly activists celebrated in the streets, living symbols of the community's resilience. As the day progressed, the true impact of Operation Daybreak began to be felt. Over 200 arrests were made, including high-ranking politicians, judges, businessmen, and dozens of corrupt police officers. Millions in assets were frozen, and an impressive amount of evidence was seized. Late in the afternoon, exhausted but triumphant, Paul gave a press conference alongside Lisa, Rachel, and Marcus. His message was clear. Today, Chicago took a giant step towards justice, but our fight has only just begun. True change will come not just from the arrests made today, but from the ongoing commitment of every citizen to integrity and justice. As the sun set on a transformed Chicago, Paul reflected on the journey that had brought him here. What began as a quest for personal vengeance had transformed into a revolution of hope for millions. The city breathed an air of change, of possibilities, but Paul knew the work was far from over. The Brotherhood had been dismantled, but the roots of corruption ran deep. The real battle, the daily fight for integrity and justice, was just beginning, and he was ready to lead it. As he looked out over the city skyline, Paul felt a mix of exhaustion and exhilaration. Chicago would never be the same, and neither would he. The path ahead was uncertain, filled with challenges and potential setbacks, but for the first time in years, there was a genuine sense of hope. Paul turned to his team. Rachel, Lisa, Marcus, Tyler, and all the others who had risked everything for this moment. "We've won a battle," he said, his voice filled with determination. "But the war for justice is far from over. Are you with me?" Their unanimous response echoed through the room, a promise of continued dedication to the cause they had all come to believe in so deeply. As night fell on Chicago, a new chapter in the city's history was beginning, and Paul Smith, once a man seeking vengeance, now stood as a symbol of what could be achieved when people dared to stand up against injustice no matter the odds. In the weeks following Operation Daybreak, Chicago underwent a profound transformation. The impact of the operation reverberated throughout the United States, triggering similar investigations in other cities and states. Paul, now a national figure, dedicated himself to ensuring that the changes would be lasting. He worked tirelessly with legislators to pass comprehensive anti-corruption reforms, closing the loopholes that had allowed the Brotherhood to flourish for so long. The trial of the criminal organization's members became one of the largest legal events in the country's history. Rachel led the prosecution, presenting a meticulously built case that left little room for doubt. The sentences were severe, sending a clear message: the era of impunity was over. In Englewood and other inner-city communities, a new era of cooperation between police and residents began to flourish. Marcus and Tyler, unlikely allies, led community policing initiatives that quickly became a model for the entire country. Captain Lisa Johnson was promoted and charged with leading a new internal affairs unit, with expanded powers to investigate and prevent police corruption. Her integrity and determination inspired a new generation of officers committed to true protection and service. Mr. Smith, recovered and strengthened, returned to his volunteer literacy work, now with renewed vigor. His personal story of resistance and triumph became a symbol of hope for the entire community. Mrs. Evelyn Washington and her group of elderly activists continued their work, now focused on keeping the memory of the struggle alive and educating new generations about the importance of civic vigilance. Alicia Mendez won the Pulitzer Prize for her coverage of Operation Daybreak, raising the standard of investigative journalism in the United States and inspiring a new wave of courageous reporting on corruption and injustice. Paul, reflecting on the journey, realized that the vengeance he initially sought had transformed into something much larger and more significant. His father's humiliation, though painful, had been the catalyst for systemic change that would benefit millions. In an emotional ceremony, Paul was honored by the city of Chicago. As he received the recognition, he dedicated the award to all who had fought alongside him, and especially to his father, whose dignity and strength had inspired everything. As Chicago entered a new era of transparency and justice, Paul knew the work was far from over. The fight against corruption and injustice would be ongoing, requiring constant vigilance. But now, looking at the city he loved, he saw something that didn't exist before. Hope. A real and tangible hope for a better future, not just for him and his family, but for all citizens of Chicago. The story of Paul and Operation Daybreak became a powerful reminder that change is possible even in the face of the most challenging adversities, and that sometimes, from the deepest injustice, the most powerful force for good can be born. 5 years after Operation Daybreak, Chicago is a transformed city. Paul, now State Attorney General, continues his fight for a fairer system. Mr. Smith, at 75, teaches civil resistance history in schools. Englewood, once known for violence, has become a model of community development. Operation Daybreak is studied in law schools and police academies across the country. Although challenges persist, there is a widespread feeling that real change is possible. Paul and his father's story has become a symbol of hope, reminding everyone that justice, though sometimes slow, can prevail. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed an incredible journey of courage, perseverance, and justice. Paul and Mr. Smith's story reminds us that each of us has the power to make a difference. Now, we want to hear from you. Comment, "I watched until the end," and share your thoughts on this thrilling story. How did it inspire you? What would you do in a similar situation? Your voice matters in this conversation about justice and social change. And don't forget to click on the video in the end screen for more inspiring stories like this one. Together, we can build a more just world, one video at a time.